Welcome to Peoples and Things, where we explore human life with technology. I'm Lee Vinsel. This episode is another new one for us. You're going to see that we'll be experimenting with form over the coming months. Like the recent episode with Cory Doctorow, we have a guest host. This time it is Mols Sauter, an assistant professor of information studies at the University of Maryland. You'll learn more about Mols and their cool work at the beginning of the episode. But the new thing is that this is the first live stream that Peoples and Things took part in. This episode is from an event that was held by Red May, a months-long spree of red arts, red theory, and red politics based in Seattle, Washington, that plots ways forward to a world beyond capitalism. We are very grateful to all the Red May organizers for asking people and things to take part in the event, and for allowing us to republish the recording as this episode. Now, the subject of this episode is Malcolm Harris's book, Palo Alto, A History of California, Capitalism, and the World. Harris is an interesting guy. I think he's sometimes talked about as a kind of voice of a generation or something like that. He is the author of, from 2017, Kids These Days, Human Capital in the Making of Millennials, and from 2020, Shit is Fucked Up and Bullshit, History Since the End of History. Then Harris did something very bizarre. He wrote a big 720-page history of Palo Alto. And I think it's pretty interesting. Palo Alto is a big history of a single U.S. city. It examines how the place developed and how it fits into larger trends and processes of capitalist production and change. Harris, who grew up in the area, finds Palo Alto to be a place haunted by its many dark legacies. In this conversation, Mols and I chat with Malcolm about what led him to write a dad book about Palo Alto, and our conversation takes us to so many different places. I hope you have a good time listening to it. I certainly had a good time doing it, and thanks again to the Red May folks. And hey, get excited. Asked me if I wanted to get into conversation with Malcolm, and Malcolm and I had already been talking back in the day about him coming on my podcast, Peoples and Things. And Kyle also asked who else we should bring to the table, and I instantly thought of Mols Sauter, and I just wanted to kind of like set up the conversation a little bit by introducing Mols. So Mols is a really cool person. They organized a conference back in grad school called Innovation and Its Discontents, which was brought together all kinds of cool people thinking about the notion of innovation and, it's others, I guess. It's people were pushing back. Then at some point, Mols and I talked because they were going to write their dissertation on the notion of disruption and how it had taken over Silicon Valley and all these places. And then we ended up going in a different direction.
Totally different. Very different.
Yeah. But we reconnected recently in Detroit at the Business History Conference, a great conference people should go to if they're into that kind of thing. And then we decided to put together a panel for the history, the Society for the History of Technology, which they should definitely take because it's great. And Mols, while we were together in Detroit, we were just talking about work and what we're reading and stuff. And they had just read Malcolm's book, and then you guys have met in other contexts. So Mols, can you tell people a little bit about your current book project? Because it is connected to this story in lots of ways. And I just thought it would be great for people to know about.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. So the current book project is based on what the dissertation ended up being, which is the role of East Coast high finance in the development of the modern venture capitalist, and specifically in the development of modern venture capital policy. And I'm focusing pretty much on a small group of people based in DC and New York who were involved in a small business administration task force you get very specific in microhistories, in 1976 through 1977, who basically, they're led by William J. Casey, who's mostly well known for being the head of the CIA during Iran-Contra. But what very few people know about Casey was that before he was part of the CIA, he was the very sort of significant federal finance appointee, and he was the head of the SEC. He was the head of the Export-Import Bank. He did a lot of work in federal finance policy, and part of the reason why he did that was sort of his very interesting history in business publishing. He made all of his money in business publishing, sort of pre-World War II, and then was part of the OSS in World War II, and then basically spent his entire career trying to get back into being a spy because he thought being a spy was the best thing in the world. But he kept being pushed into these finance roles. And he is the head of this task force at the Small Business Administration to address the crisis in small business funding. Whether or not there is a crisis in small business funding is a valid question at the time. And they end up creating what is essentially the policy framework that gives us the modern venture capitalist, down to like cracking open pensions to make pensions available for high risk investment, changing some very significant SEC rules at a very specific time, changing some other different sort of taxation structures, and making what is known currently as the sort of limited partnership, institutionally supported venture capital firm, the dominant firm structure, sort of making that firm structure possible and then helping it to dominate the space. And so that's what the next book project is about. I love it. Yeah, I've been working on it for a while. We're shopping it to publishers now. We'll hopefully next, 18 months, academic timelines. We'll see how it goes.
Right on. Well, Malcolm, my buddy Aaron Gordon, a writer at Motherboard, and I are into the Oxford History of the U.S. series, because we love dad history books that are 7 pages long, and I'm into that kind of thing. And so you wrote a dad history book about Palo Alto, right? So
unintentionally, on accident.
So I want to hear about tell me. So let's start there. How was it an accident?
Well, so, everyone, every young man just wants to be Joan Didion, and you end up being dad history. No,
I told my editor, they're like, what kind of book do you want to write? I'm like, I want to write a smart dad history book. And they're like, is that a thing? And I'm like, yes, it is a thing. So I'm glad you're here blazing the trail for dad history books.
I wish I'd pitched it that way, because it definitely was not pitched at this length or even this form.
Yeah.
And honestly, I'm not sure if they would have bought it, because I don't... Unlike you two,
weirdos.
Lovely, talented, hardworking people, I don't have any graduate degrees. And to access the sort of authority to write this kind of straight history, it helps if you have some kind of personal connection that you're going to weave through. And then you can say, oh, I'm a good writer, so let me write this history, because it's going to be autobiographical or whatever. Yeah. I read Sebald or Didion, or I'm going to do it like that. And a lot of people, or a fair number, I think, of writers in my cohort have taken that sort of institutional situation that's maybe not great, to be honest, right? And you look back at the mid 20th century, you could be a 27-year-old who's just got a mouth, and you can have the authority to write whatever you want. And a lot of our very important texts come out of people just talking shit like that. A little different now. But when I tried to do that kind of writing, it didn't really work. And I did a fair amount of it. And so I have the files on my computer somewhere where I'm weaving my personal childhood experience, 8 through 18, that I spent in Palo Alto through this story of this place.
Right.
And a few things happened, which is that, I didn't like doing it. I don't think I'm very good at it. I don't think it read very well. Kind of absurd almost, the juxtaposition of this history that I was doing. And I was finding a lot more straight history stuff that I wanted to tell than I expected to in the first place. And so when I wrote my first chapter out, doing a straight history chapter, it was 3 times as long as I planned it to be. And I had this really, dense outline that I was committed to. to doing this whole story straight through and not taking any sort of metaphorical jumps through the decades, but actually doing it, decade by decade, that it was just all going to be 3 times as long as I originally planned, even without any personal stuff. So luckily, I have a great editor at Little Brown, and she agreed with me that the other stuff wasn't as good, and that the straight history was working better. And she let me, like, I still can't believe that they published it at the size that they did. Like, it's totally surreal. This, just like as an object to me, it's totally surreal.
If you're explaining it to a stranger, what do you say it's about, and what were you trying to do with this thing?
Well, it depends, like, the context in which I meet the stranger, right?
Yeah.
But mostly, if a totally, Rawlsian, blank slate person that I were to encounter, I tell them that it's a straight history all the way through of Palo Alto, California, from its founding in the 1870s and pre-founding in the gold rush through to the present day, and that no one had tried to write this book before. And that's like the dad history straight up. Like, it's 1870s to now, the history of America and the world development and the development of the capitalist world system through this place, Palo Alto, California, step by step through the whole thing from then till now. And it was this part, the way I came to think about it was that it's part of this sort of rewriting of American history that we've been doing lately, a re-examination of the post-Reconstruction era and the sort of second American history that starts then. And California hasn't been told as part of that history. We look to, continue in terms of this model of the relationships between the South and the North into the late 19th into the 20th century. But California, rushes onto the scene in that period and makes an immediate difference. And so much of it clicks for me when you see that, like, California teams up with the South to end Reconstruction, to end the occupation of the South, in order to pass the Chinese Exclusion Act, and that these, like, racialist logics and that were so tied up with the labor markets and labor costs were mutually reinforcing, from this moment at the end of the 19th century that is constitutive and foundational for this, like, second American history. So maybe I'd go into that stuff depending on, like, read the 1619 Project, or, you compare it, you do comps, if you're selling it to your editor versus selling it to an editor.
Miles was picking up on this haunting theme in our conversation. Miles, why don't you kick it over there?
Yeah, so I really love the beginning of the book where you're talking about the haunting and how Palo Alto is haunted, California is haunted by these crimes of the past that can not only can they never be atoned for, but also they are always constantly present. But there isn't another sort of way of thinking about haunting and sort of hauntology as you're haunted by lost futures. You're haunted by the things that you cannot have that have been foreclosed to you because of choices that have been made in the past. And sort of like both, this is a thing that the region is haunted by this, the people are haunted by this, the children that you talk about are haunted by this, the fucking horses are haunted by this. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about how the foreclosure of futures, or maybe the over-defining of futures, and how futures are foreclosed through this over-defining of potential works in this text?
Yeah, there are some interesting moments where you see sort of attempts at different things throughout the history, whether that's, the halcyon commune in California, where you've got, like, poets and engineers and immigrants and agriculturalists working together under, like, a pretty sort of utopian model. And there are lots of projects like that in California. And a bunch that I didn't know, like so many early, really at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century political projects in California and Palo Alto. Like, I knew there was a new left presence, but before that, I didn't know much about, like, the old left and even, like, the First International, right? And a figure like Har Dayal, who leads this uprising of East Indian agricultural workers on the west coast of North America as a army that they are, anti-colonial army that they, put on boats and lead on a struggle against the British occupation, and is, foundational to the history of anti-colonial struggle in the 20th century in India. I had no idea like Palo Alto played a role in that, and that they were like organizing out of like a shack near the railroad, and that they like Stanford got sort of tricked into providing the auspices for this kind of thing, the Radical Anarchist Communist Revolutionary Society, like the coolest name that you could think of, right? Real like crazy folks doing really exciting things, and founding, being involved in the foundations of the first communist parties around the world. And it's really like the international Pacific left that we're coming to understand a little bit more. I think that the political history of California is haunted by that, but maybe not in such a bad way. I don't know. I think like that the left-wing tradition of California communism is something that I think we need to like develop further. And if people just started noticing now, I think, which makes sense because Alta California, Anglo-American Alta California, is only 200 years old, not even. Mm-hmm. And so now we're looking like at the political traditions that are coming out of that history. I think there's going to be more, we're going to come to understand them more, and they're going to be more important as we go on. So are we haunted by that? I know what you're talking about, the failure of the Soviet Union sort of haunts the left, and I guess is the thesis. But California was really an exception to that experience in a lot of ways. Like the American Communist Party in general, their hands are not very bloody, honestly, with the crimes of 20th century communism, partly because they just weren't very powerful. So they just like worked for civil rights a lot of the time, and like can generally take a lot of pride in what they did. And the California communists were even on the far end of that. So like when the communists kicked out the Japanese because they didn't want to like look bad, like they were collaborating with the Japanese, the California communists said, yeah, okay, we're still going to let all our Japanese members contribute the same way that they were going to. And like they were even like more insulated from the sort of top-down party rule, which I think like is part of the reason we have this left-wing communist tradition and perspective that continues out of California, and that's exemplified in someone like Mike Davis and his work. That seems strange in the history of like left-wing thought, but then when you put it in the history of California left-wing thought, he's like right in there. It makes total sense, and he's done so much of that work explaining sort of himself and where he comes from. And I definitely see this work as aspiring to be in that tradition and help cast more light on that history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes total sense.
Miles, keep going.
Well, so I think a lot about venture, obviously, and sort of what venture is and the processes of venture. And one thing I've been thinking about recently is like, what is valuation? Like, what is evaluation? How do you work evaluation, and what is its purpose? And one of the things that I've been thinking about sort of in conversation with this text is valuation is a process of dragging the future into the present and draining it and like hollowing it out and like making exploitative use of the future now.
Yeah.
And that I see happening in like at every level of this text is that the Palo Alto system is about nailing down potential and like materializing it in a way that is deeply sort of creepy once you start to think about it. And like it has that weird sort of bad magic on top of it, where it's like you're taking something that is supposed to be airy and in the future, and something that is aspirational and something that is a thing that you go out and you experience, and you are instead concretizing it in the present. And there's something deeply weird and bad magic about that.
And getting something out of it, right?
Sorry?
Getting something out of it.
Getting something out of it in a way that steals something from someone later.
Yeah.
Because that's what it is. It's about taking the value from the future and spending it now.
But I think it was helpful for me, and I think we got over 20 minutes in before I say the name Herbert Hoover, which
Herbert
I think is
Hoover is here.
He's, that's his music. It was helpful to me to understand the capitalist's perspective to see how it's supposed to work in their thinking, how this finance mechanism is supposed to work in their thinking. Because they are thinking about, you take value from the future and you bring it to today, but it's not supposed to steal it from the future, right? It's supposed to be like a stepping stool so that you fake it till you make it.
You're supposed to sort of multiply it. It's supposed to be more.
Is that if you can count on it being there in 2 years, you can borrow against it now and get you to that 2 years, right? You can tell a story about where you're going that helps you, along that path. And seeing the billion, Herbert Hoover doesn't get much credit. And I do think it's funny that some of the reviews think that this book is just like solely, it is anti-capitalist, but they think the examination of capital and capitalists is very one-sided, and that I'm just looking at Leland Stanford, who's a goof or whatever. But Herbert Hoover as president and as commerce secretary was very successful at using these finance mechanisms for some very important stuff. And so Roosevelt gets a lot of credit for the airplane industry, right? And for switching over the factory systems to build airplanes. And this is a strong feat of government leadership, the opposite of for finance-led development or whatever. But Hoover, it was really Hoover is the one who triggered the air boom, right? There was no reason for the United States to be a leader in airplanes necessarily at that time. And it was Hoover who and his cabal of associates, right? And finance capital on the East Coast that piled into airline stocks and says, we're going to make this happen, that this is a strategic importance. And that it wasn't about government investment for him, but was about government mediation in creating the
associationalism is
exactly the opportunities for people to get along and make it happen. And the Guggenheims played this central role, including hiring Lindbergh to fly around and promote airplanes. And this seems like such a very contemporary move, right? Is you get they not only got Lindbergh to do it, but paid him in stock. And so that he becomes a promoter, a stock promoter for the airplane. This is genius. Yeah. You can get the flight to pay for itself, and this is very successful. This builds the airline, the air industry, and of course with government contracts, they're giving mail contracts very selectively to the companies that they want to support. Hoover specifically is giving it to his friends. And they're developing the avionics industry, and they were developing the federal government is still building the apparatus that allows for the capitalist association to make these investments, whether that's mapping, and scientific research, instrument research, that they're all these companies are going to be
standards, and all these groups are
exactly
supporting these efforts. Yep.
And they're all in the Department of Commerce, where Herbert Hoover has put them and where he's overseen them and where he's brought the interested parties in to come and decide these things, right, together. And so this was the model of finance associationalism and how it was supposed to work, right? And so it wasn't just a story that they told themselves about why they were getting rich and that they were just scamming people, sort of was for Leland Stanford and the railroad guys, the original associationists. But so when Wall Street collapses, when this all doesn't work, right? When the Great Depression hits, and all which is really due to the profligacy of these financiers that Hoover is trying to cool down, that he's saying come on guys, if this is going to work, we all have to be cool.
They never listened to the poor guy,
And they didn't listen to him. They were, and it was FDR who had just as much authority and sort of presence to tell them to cool it.
Yeah.
And it all blows up, and he's held responsible. And so he feels really betrayed, and also personally betrayed by DuPont, by Hearst, by some of these big capitalists who abandon him for Roosevelt, as if he wasn't their guy. And so he gets very bitter.
It's very sad. Herbert's story is a very sad one, I think. I wrote about him too in my first book, and I'm a huge, so your Hoover chapter, it was beautiful. I want to give the people who are watching a little bit of sense of how your book moves, including kind of just walking through some of the history and just giving, sketching it out a bit. But I'm also picked up on another great thing. This kind of what we were on the phone calling anti great man history. And so I want to make sure to get this on the record, and then about settler stuff.
Now that we've cracked the seal on Herbert Hoover.
Yeah, exactly.
I think all of us are working on projects, or have recently been working on projects, where we are like delving pretty deeply into the like psychology of specific people.
Yep.
Where you've got Herbert Hoover, I've got Casey, who I continually refer to as my favorite monster. And like, I'm interested in like what his internal state is, why he made these series of choices, what his motivations are, how you can see those motivations in like the things he writes and the policies he tries to pass. And I just wanted to open the door for you to talk a little bit about writing a Marxist history, which has traditionally been sort of very systemic, that pays so much attention to the specificities, the personalities, the traumas, and like this, then the historical specificity of in what another sort of written tradition might be called great man history.
Yeah, that is a great question. Because I've seen some people, in some of the like reviews or something, some people have called it like history from below, or referred to it that way because there are stories about workers organizing in there. Which, like, that's an important historical tradition and a very valuable one. And I've read a bunch of those and incorporated their insights into this book, but that's not the tradition this book is working in. Mm-hmm. This is, for me, a history of capital relations. And so that means you're going to have a bunch of capitalists and you're going to have a bunch of workers, right? And it's not a like exhaustive perspective. There are a lot of things that this book doesn't do, obviously, even at sort of the max length. I tell people that Google Docs cut me off, which is true. There's a character limit on Google Docs.
You found it.
If I found it, they'll cut you off. And to do that, I found that like someone like Herbert Hoover, I had to talk about a lot. And I found myself frustrated by that because I wasn't planning on it at all. I wanted to like skip World War II as a like, haha, like, see, you think I would talk about that, but I'm going to talk about something else. Also did not work because these things are very important from the perspective that I'm approaching the topic from. And Herbert Hoover becomes important, not just because he like personally makes a lot of relevant choices and is the guy who puts Palo Alto onto the national and global stage personally and like becomes the president and whatever. In his embodiment of these historical forces, like he encounters other historical forces. And that's what's so interesting for me, is that like as an embodiment and avatar of capital, he like personally encounters the historical phenomenon of class struggle as something in his life, right? So it's not like they are taking the mines, they're taking my mines. And he experiences not just like one uprising, but because his interests are so global and because he has associates everywhere, the world anti-colonial movement, the world communist movement is personal for him. And then it becomes literally personal for him because they're also showing up at his personal doorstep. Whether that's the Hoover Farm in California, which is a site of a like key labor moment in the 30s and the farm uprisings in California at the Hoover Farm, as well as the bonus march at the White House, where he ends up opening up on these. You can watch the video. People should like look up the video of this stuff, which is crazy. On the bonus marchers, which were some American soldiers. This is one we like learn in American history because it sort of closes the door on the Hoover story, is that during the Depression, you have these American soldiers who march on the White House asking to get their bonus payments that they're owed early, veterans from World War I. And Hoover, sort of inexplicably, as far as the regular American history class is concerned, attacks them with the military. Specifically, Douglas MacArthur leads the military to attack their own soldiers and burns their camp, and it's like brutal. And it, seals Hoover's fate against FDR or whatever. But from his perspective, after seeing it in the context of these global uprisings, to me, it made a lot of sense, right? He was like, there they are, like here they're storming the Winter Palace, like the poor soldiers are here, the communists, right? And so he interpreted things in terms of these historical phenomena because he was himself the like avatar of all these historical phenomena. And so that's how I wanted to understand him. And so his personal qualities are relevant, and I talk about their relevance because they're relevant to capital and to the forces that sort of pluck him out of history and put him in this big role, and then pluck him out just as fast, right? And so he experiences it that way. And not like history isn't a product of Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover is a product of history. And we see that too often where we think of like, oh, the world we live in is Steve Jobs's world. Like Steve Jobs thought this way, and so the world is that way. When really it's like Steve Jobs thought this way, and so that's how he got that job. Like he was performing a particular function to these historical forces. And so that's how I want to understand him. What that does lead to, though, and that people, I think some maybe perceptive critics have said that, like, well, capital gets personified in these individuals, and then labor tends to sort of disappear into groups. And so capital becomes, paradoxically more human than labor, which has much more people, right?
That's really interesting, yeah.
And it's sort of true, but I don't think that's necessarily we shouldn't associate, I don't think, like being humanized in these kind of histories as like
that's a tough one.
Morally positive necessarily. People are like, oh, he's really humanized. And so I tried to like dehumanize the very human characters that we understand, right? And so someone like Shockley or someone like Hoover, they're very important as individuals, but their characteristics are so determined, right? And if they weren't there, somebody else would have been there instead of them. And I think that's sort of like doesn't make them seem more important. It makes them contextual.
Yeah.
So I want to give a sense like how you kick the book off historically, but I think because the story of Indigenous people comes up in your intro, you return to it at the end of the book. It's clearly like a really important issue. I think we should get that on the table before we do a little section hopping. But Malls, why don't you had a nice way of putting that, so hop on.
Well, this I'm going to pull right from the event that you did at UMD last week that I went to, where you talked about the anxiety of settlerism and the anxiety of the settler and anxiety of settler colonialism. And I wanted to ask you if you could talk a bit about how this is an ongoing fact. This is an ongoing activity. This isn't something that happened and is now over and now we have to clean up the mess. It's like, no, it's a thing that is still occurring. And so I wanted to know if you would just talk a little bit about sort of the persistence of settlerism, the persistence of the colonial agenda, and sort of the persistence of that anxiety.
Yeah. One place that's interesting to look at and a place to start is the Stanford University land acknowledgement. And so people should like Google that because it's a very interesting webpage, because they acknowledge the Muwekma Ohlone tribe, which is a politically constituted organization. Now I believe has 614 members, I believe, all of whom have a genetic tie to remains that are millennia old in the Bay Area, right? These are tribal members of a tribe that Stanford acknowledges as the ancestral title holders. But not only do they acknowledge them, but the page itself includes some rhetoric about how the rhetoric of land acknowledgements is insufficient and that we need to look at the return of land and land back, like quote unquote, and has like a link to like more information about returning land, which I think is interesting because it does speak to that anxiety, right? Of like, is one thing to acknowledge, but then you still feel anxious about the acknowledgement. And then you have to say like, oh, okay, well, I feel bad about that. Like it should be more than that. But then like they can't do the thing that is actually returning the land. And so they do everything else, right? Which is like they name stuff after things.
Yeah.
They change names of things.
We get stuck there. I mean, I think that shit's good. Change the name of things.
They should change the name of things. They should change, but then the question is, are you going to change the name of Stanford University? And they're not going to, right?
No.
Leland Stanford was personally responsible for, signing genocide checks, basically. They're not going to take his name. It's not going to be the Muwekma Ohlone University. Because then the Muwekma Ohlone, you just say, okay, are we going to be in charge of the university?
Yeah.
And this is a tribal organization that's still fighting for federal recognition, but does have recognition from Stanford University, which has returned remains to the tribal organization, even though they don't have federal recognition. And what the feds say is, we recognize that you used to be a tribe, that you were a tribe, in the 19th century, and that in the beginning of the 20th century, you a group of people, you're keeping your traditions up, etc. And then like the Great Depression, World War II, what happened to you guys? Like, we don't know. And then you pop up again in the 80s, and then we recognize you again in the 80s. But we don't want to hear anything about before this time or after this time. We only want evidence from this middle period that shows your tribal existence, through a time of like national upheaval and a time when natives in California were being Hispanicized, right? We're being treated as Chicana, Mexicans, even though they lived in the same land for centuries, millennia, whatever. And so then it becomes a struggle to produce not just documents showing, okay, we were a tribe and we're a tribe, but this middle period of we were a tribe at every moment through that period. So that's where the struggle for the Muwekma Ohlone is going on right now. And it's ongoing to this day, right? The powwow is this coming weekend, and this organization will take part, right? It's recognized by the university. And so I start with the dispossession of the indigenous people of Alta California, and then I end with the continued dispossession of the indigenous people of Alta California, and show that the struggle for land, for sovereignty, for territory has gone on throughout this history of the tech industry, and that you have like redevelopment that's going on in downtown San Jose in the 80s that's being driven directly, not just driven by the tech industry, but being driven by Steve Jobs personally meeting with the mayor of San Jose saying, oh, we're going to move our headquarters here, there, whatever. And the construction of that redevelopment in that interest is digging up remains that then lead to struggle over this territory. And that this needs to be written as part of the same history and into today as part of the same history. So major effort of the book, and I think a continuing effort politically that I want to continue to be involved in as a result of the book.
That's great, man. And so the first part starts. The first section starts in 1850. I mean, and it covers 1850 to 1900. So set the scene for the folks who haven't read it yet. What's the scene? What's the first shot?
So you get the gold rush, but I try and give this is where Alta California history starts, generally with the gold rush. You point back to the Spanish missionary period a little bit, so that you like blame the death of indigenous people on the Spanish. You say so that when we showed up, we were just kicking out, those other colonizers, and there were like 12 of them, so it's fine. And so I talk about Fremont's campaign and the conquest of California for the United States, which as a military campaign is extremely goofy. Like the Bear Flag Republic stuff is like super, like real bunch of guys with some guns situation. And the reason that they're able to take this giant and very historically consequential territory is that Alta California was the like furthest corner of the world as far as Western capital was concerned at this point. Okay. That it was like the colonization of Alta California by the Spanish was very coastal, very thin. The missions couldn't absorb that much indigenous labor. And so like they did kill a lot of people, roughly half the indigenous population with disease, but there were still 150,000 indigenous people in California at the time of the American takeover. that constituted the bulk of the population, and then who still had a traditional relationship to the land for the most part. And so you have to commit genocide. And a lot of this happens during the Civil War, and we don't think of it, it's sort of hidden historically by what else was going on in the country and written out of that period. But Leland Stanford, the railroad baron, who is the embodiment of capital in the West, and really put out as this embodiment of capital in the West by his associates who were more competent than he was, and who recognized that like being out in front at that time of history was maybe not the best idea, were responsible for this and then profited from it directly, to tie it into our last question.
Beautiful. Miles, what are you thinking?
I think it's time to talk about horses.
All right. The beginning of Palo Alto. Well, so to get to horses, though, we have to start with the railroad. So Leland Stanford is this embodiment of capital in the West in the 1870s. And being the embodiment of capital anywhere in the 1870s is a high-risk job. Because workers are all being proletarianized and they're very angry. And the Working Men's Party, which was the like California affiliate of the First International, was no exception. Bunch of angry guys, specifically angry, and they were a white group of guys, were angry at Stanford and the other associates for bringing in Chinese laborers to complete the transcontinental, which affected their place in the labor market, which they understand correctly as affecting their place in the labor market. And so they would organize outside Leland Stanford's house, which was on the top of Nob Hill, we call Nob Hill now in San Francisco, and yell at him and say, "We're going to come get you," and like, "Come down or we're going to get you." And he was very like blasé because he was kind of a dumbass about that threat. And he was like there's this great scene that this journalist records where like the workers are outside the window shouting at him, and Stanford is showing the journalist these vases that he got that used to belong to Marie Antoinette. You know, like, check out these beautiful vases. Like, aren't these cool? And the journalist was like, "Yeah, man. Like, I don't know though.
Look at these historically resonant vases."
I know. And he's like, "Do you think they might be haunted?" Speaking of haunt, and he writes about it. He's like, "Yeah, I don't know. You should like find something else to do with that or whatever."
Man.
Well, and it turns sad a little bit when his firstborn son dies in a very like sort of biblical curse moment. His only child. But before that, he has to do what a lot of rich people do when they live in the city and their workers like won't stop yelling at them, which is move his family to the suburbs. Except the suburbs in the 1870s don't exist yet, and so he has to create his own suburb to move his family to escape the class tension that he has also created. And that is the origin of the town of Palo Alto, which is the suburb that he creates to move his family to. But what do you do in the suburb that you moved your family to? Leland Stanford sets about building the biggest and most excellent horse stock farm in the world in Palo Alto. And this is a subject that he'd been interested in before. And the stock farm is most famous, especially in science and technology studies, which maybe some people in the audience might be from, for yielding the photographs of Edward Muybridge, which are the first moving pictures, which lead to the technology of motion pictures. And so the Stanford horse breeding whole complex is treated as like the thing that led to Muybridge's motion pictures. And Stanford was sort of this like rich guy who funded those because he was frivolous. There's a story about how it was about gambling, that he was betting whether all four hooves were off the ground at the same time. Yeah. That wasn't true. He was involved in a very important scientific project, which was scientific commercial national project, which was creating a better horse. Mm-hmm. And he was really into horse breeding and horse training. And horses at the time were very important. And the transition to coal-based energy hadn't really happened yet.
Mhm.
And so you have horses are crucially important in transportation, in canals and streetcars. They're dragging stuff through the canals. They're dragging streetcars. Agricultural implements. They're pulling plows through the fields. As a military, they're pulling cannons and artillery and stuff. It's like they were the engines of the country.
Yeah, for sure.
Even in mines, you know, if they're like crushing for a quartz mine, you're driving those by horses or mule. And so they were the engines of the country and of the world. And Leland Stanford, you know, like a good disruptor, says, I know this is a millennia old technology, the trotting horse, you know, horse carriages. I'm going to reinvent it. I can scale. I can do things that no one else can do. I'm going to create a new horse. And he says, you know, there are 1.3 million horses in the United States, or no, there are 13, I got to remember my numbers correctly. There are 13 million horses in the United States. If I can improve them all by $100 each in their value, that's worth 1.3 billion to the country, you know. And this is classic like VC logic, as you know, if you scale this out, if you know, look at the number, it goes
everyone
up,
signs
you know?
up for the thing, we get the hockey stick.
If every horse becomes $100 better, the country is going to be that much. And this was a major concern. There had been the Great Epizootic, which is a national horse influenza epidemic that kills 1% of American horses and incapacitates basically all of the horses. And Boston burns down because the horses drag the fire engines, and you can't have the fire engines. And people are like dragging the streetcars, you know, streetcar operators are dragging the streetcars with their legs, and it's all the canals shut down, and it's a total catastrophe. So, and it doesn't end up being true that horses are going to be very important into the 20th century, because they get replaced very quickly by steam power for most of their like important functions. But Stanford succeeds in what they call the Palo Alto system, which is creating this new kind of horse. And they're taking inspiration from Germany, where they're doing early childhood education for the first time with these kindergartens. So he builds a kindergarten track, and he says, instead of letting horses, you know, get older before we try and find out how fast the fastest ones are, we're going to race them as young as possible. And then we're going to invest a ton of money in the most successful ones. And then we're going to sell their genetic material. And so it's a very, you know, it doesn't matter that we're going to ruin a bunch of very expensive horses in the process because of our scale and our investment. We can afford to do it. And they call this system the Palo Alto system. And it's immediately like very, very, very successful, and produces some of the fastest trotting horses in the world, the fastest, youngest trotting horses in the world specifically.
We had a really good question from Twitter from someone whose name I did not write down, which I should have. But it was essentially a sort of, what does it mean for a city to give its name to a system? And in this case, it's really interesting because the system gets named after not the city yet. And sort of the city grows up in the shadow of the system itself. And so it's almost like the city is named after the system. So what does it like? I would love to talk a bit about like the power, like names have power, like the power of naming, and how we are seeing the system and the city come up together in a very intertwined way.
Yeah, I was surprised when I was writing this. I mean, so that was the original, one of the earlier titles for the book, the prospective titles for the book, right? Was the Palo Alto system, which ended up sounding too like business-like, right? Doesn't that sound like a VC book? And I thought that was maybe like cool, like, aha, the Palo Alto system, you bought the wrong book, sucker. I was surprised that it hadn't been used this way much throughout the literature, like the regional business literature, because it's this very like resonant anecdote, like model that they use and name that Charles Marvin, and who is the lead trainer at the stock farm, and Leland Stanford like come up with and use, that speaks to so much of what goes on in this region and the regional like business ecosystem into the future. That people hadn't been using it this way in the past. And I think partly because it was like kind of obscure, And again, like Muybridge so dominates our understanding of those events, partly because he was really good at self-branding and like found a way to tell the story and make it about him like constantly. And there have been some good books about like, so Rebecca Solnit's book about Muybridge is really good. There are like, there are more books about like Muybridge and Stanford and Muybridge period than there are about Stanford, even though he's a governor and senator and he like does all this important stuff. Like Muybridge is such an interesting historical figure that he really dominates that period. And so even when people want to do like metaphorical jumps about Palo Alto from the 19th century or early 20th century to now or to the post-war, they'll usually take that one because it's a good story. But the Palo Alto system, I think, is just like the best metaphor for the area, and speaks so much to the like impersonal injunctions and values that characterize the place and structure its history into the present. And so like when I read about the Palo Alto system, I was like, it was a moment of instant recognition in a sort of like chilly way. And I've talked to other people from Palo Alto, young people who grew up there, who read about this story about them saying like, oh, well, it's okay to work the young horses as fast as possible because if they break, then they were never really that good in the first place. And having with the story of this high youth suicide rate that I start the book with, that's creepy, that there's a talk about haunting, right? That's hugely resonant into the present. But it's not that like people understood the Palo Alto system by that name and continued to use it. So like people, unless they read this book, have never heard of that, even if they are very involved in the Palo Alto region. Like it's not part of the official history. And Palo Alto is somewhere that's got a really deep official history. For someone that like their whole history is very narrow, or for a place that's got a very like, duration wise in terms of American history, very short history compared to, like Boston has a much longer history. Alta California, Anglo-American Alta California, much shorter period of time. And yet it's got a very like closely written official history that capitalists have spent a fair amount of money, funding. And so you can find there like Bank of America is writing its own history books like very early. So a lot of our history of Bank of America comes from Bank of America funded history into the present, where like the recent book about the Stuart Brand history that Markov wrote is like written in association with a group of guys who are involved in the history that they're telling, and so there becomes this pretty well-defined official history. And people just read the same books or read the same oral histories or listen to the same speeches and then ask the same guys, what do you remember about that time? And they'll tell you about the things that they remember from the book that they read about the thing that they did at the time. And it creates this unfortunate loop. And the Palo Alto system is not part of that official history. But that's too bad. They should work that in there.
They really should. It's so creepy.
So I think we should keep walking forward through the book because there's so much great stuff. And I mean, two things, Malcolm. First of all, it's a beautifully written book. I really like it's written in a voice where it's just a wonderful example after example. It's really detailed in a great way. So there's no way we can do justice to a 700-page book with all these great stories in an hour. There's no way. But I do want to keep walking. I will keep an eye on the comments. If people have high quality comments, we'll turn to those, and we'll turn to any questions folks have if they have good ones. And otherwise,
I like that standard. Any questions you got, as long as they're good.
Yep, they're good. There are, in fact, stupid questions.
And so, I love the late 19th century stuff. It's great. I mean, it's just classic robber baron. And I mean, you're not telling that kind of simplistic story, but it's this late 19th century industrialist stuff. The period from 1900 to 1945, I feel like in some ways this is the gap in my understanding in sometimes in this history of told earlier. There's I was thinking about O'Mara's history. We could talk about how you related your book to other books that were around. But I was just wondering, what did you want to get across to people from this 1900 to 1945? You covered there's Raisin Ku Klux Klan and IQ stuff. this is where Hoover comes in, of course. But then we get to tubes, and so I wonder, like, what kind of transformations are going on in this period that you think are really important for people to know about?
Yeah, the radio age is really important. And in terms of the history of the technology, it's really important. So one of my, side quest type goals for the book, I had a bunch of them. But one was to get people, if they wanted to, you don't have to do this stuff to read the book if you don't want to, but to actually understand the technical evolution of how you go from a light bulb style triode to a semiconductor based computer, and what that technical progression looks like, and how it's much shorter than you might imagine, right? That like a semiconductor-based transistor, a point contact transistor or whatever, is a triode, which is the same thing that they were building in the radio age in Palo Alto. And it's built by Federal Telegraph, and that these things are not like metaphorically connected or whatever, but very directly connected. And I think the history, most of the histories of the area take a jump around there, right? Whether it's the beginning of the 20th century, or like maybe they dip into the radio age a little bit, or they talk about Charles Lytton and the tubes a little bit, and the beginning of Hewlett-Packard. Sometimes they'll start with Hewlett-Packard, they get to the radio age, or they talk about Frederick Terman is very important, obviously, the radio age. But for me, it was really important to tell that story all the way through in its global context, because that was the context that matters for me.
Yeah.
And so what's going on in those years is a like global struggle about the future of the world. And it's one that Palo Alto is very much tied up in. And so it's in that context that we can see these devices, right? Because they're building all these devices, and that's the official history centers around these devices, as if there's sort of some natural progression of these devices towards the devices that we have now.
Yeah.
And we need to like read it backwards through the progression, like evolutionarily or whatever. But if you do it through the anxieties of Herbert Hoover and his buddies in the beginning of the 20th century, you'll see that they had some real problems, that the 20th century, that period for them was a very anxious one, especially between, World War I and the end of the period that I'm talking about in the book, where and through the post-colonial period that we talk about is where they really have to act on their understanding of the world, where the position of these guys, some white engineer guys in California, is threatened. And this idea that they are going to continue to occupy this like vaunted perch on top of a world did not seem exceptionally plausible at a time when you've got a global communist movement that's on the march, you've got an anti-colonial movement that's on the march. Yeah. And from their perspective, the natural progression that's going on wasn't to the personal computer or whatever, it was towards communism and the liberation of all peoples and like world equality. That like, the liberalism of the 18th and 19th century was being expanded to a world where everyone knew about each other, and that the extension of that was going to be the elimination of privilege based on nationality, privilege based on skin, privilege based on, region. That seemed obvious to not just them, but to many people throughout the world, right? This seemed to be the obvious sequence of history, and was for them a deeply threatening thing, and clearly the most important thing that was going on in the world. And so when you see them in that context, the devices that they end up coming up with make a lot more sense, not just as some natural progression of technology that humans figure out, Prometheus and this is Silicon Valley loves to talk about itself that way, right? That like there's fire, there's the wheel, and then we came up with the computer. It's just one more thing along the natural line. But it was a specific, geopolitical, historical project that they were involved in, and you don't really understand the shape of it without understanding the shape of world politics of the period.
Yep. I want to get up to the 70s and 80s for a variety of reasons. First of all, you and Malls have to talk about the Iran-Contra thing.
That's right.
We got stuff to do. But I do want to kind of like the 45 to 75 section. I mean, this is stuff. So we have World War II, we have the Cold War, right, and we have semiconductors, and then we have like the chapter you call the personal revolution. We have the hippies, and that leads to like there's the Turner counterculture to cyberculture narrative. Another book that we could talk about, but I wanted to say, like, when you're telling this story, which if it comes to like history of Silicon Valley, Palo Alto, this is a story that's been told in a variety of ways. So like, what did you, Malcolm, want to do with this thing? Like what was your angle on it that you wanted to give people?
Yeah. Well, I'm a communist and a Marxist, right? So I'm going to tell this history as a history of class struggle, which is different than how most of the official histories are told, but not different from, there's been a lot of very important work within, I think, the broad category of ethnic studies that takes a similar perspective. And people who aren't familiar with ethnic studies don't know that that's the methodology, but that's a key part of the methodology. And so if you read a lot of the work that's been done in women's studies as well, in ethnic studies, and Black studies, if you want to be more specific, Chicano studies, is looking at the history of capital versus labor within California, and sometimes within Palo Alto very specifically. Labor history is a little like thinner, right? A little thinner on the West Coast. There's definitely some of it. Obviously, there's Mike Davis.
Lou Hyman's book has some it has some good stuff on this, on immigration and such. But yeah, I mean, like, keep going. Keep going with this thought.
And so, I don't want to suggest that mine is the only history of this area that like takes on this perspective of capital and labor, because it's just totally not true. There's a lot of very valuable stuff, but sort of the official like pop history is very like capital and capital. Sometimes capital versus capital, sometimes capital like capital versus itself, or capital versus government for sure. West Coast capital versus East Coast capital, which is, I think, is kind of a funny narrative that they like to tell about themselves.
It's like rap, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. And very important to some of those people, which is, I think, kind of silly, as Malls is the interconnection of the Wall Street and Silicon Valley is much tighter than they would have us believe
a lot
about that history. But then also trying to contextualize it globally, right? Because California gets told sometimes within national history, within like some East-West progression, manifest destiny, United States history. But I think Alta California is better understood, at least in the first decades, especially as an overseas colony of the United States. And it starts to make like different, and I think a lot more sense from that perspective. And then you can see its history going on in those terms, and you can see its like historical analogs, I think, a little clearer. It was interesting talking to like radio programs in Australia and New Zealand has been really an interesting experience of the promotion, because their history lines up so much, like their colonial history lines up so much with this history, and they say like, oh yeah, like we know about Herbert Hoover. We've met Herbert Hoover. He's part of our history too, and he is. And the same thing in South Africa. Like Herbert Hoover is part of South African history. So contextualizing it within the global 19th and 20th centuries was important for me, and I think has been useful, and people have commented that it's helped them see different things about California and its role in like Pacific history and global history.
So I do want to talk about Iran-Contra at some point, but Malls, mostly I want to just kick it over to you. What are you thinking now?
Well, we can drag Iran-Contra into here if that's what we want to talk about.
No, if you got something else too, man, you should just do what you're thinking. Whatever.
No, like let's jump to Iran-Contra. Let's jump to Casey and his weird laptop.
Yeah. How is this a Palo Alto story, Iran-Contra?
Yeah, right. You don't think of Iran-Contra as a Palo Alto story, but it really is one. So the like front organization that they really like run the project out of, that Oliver North like uses as the proxy, is called Stanford Technology Corp, which I think is like really fantastic embodiment of the moment historically, because Stanford technology, you know, in the 80s means something so totally different from what you'd think. You don't think Iran-Contra at all when you think Stanford technology in the 80s. You think like the personal computer. And this is where I talk about like the personal revolution, right? You think about like not big government, but instead the individual home and like small businesses. And this is the story. And like enthusiasts, the internet of enthusiasts, you know, we're going to share Grateful Dead tapes. Or like left-wing flyers, or, you know, whatever. There are a lot of these. This is the official history. But then when I was looking at the Iran-Contra story, partly through the Stanford Technology Corp angle, it became clear the real role of Silicon Valley, this early sort of, or like, still early Silicon Valley industry, was playing internationally and as part of the Cold War as a weapons contractor. Mm-hmm. And it's funny that if you watch like the movies from like the 80s about where they're doing like international intrigue or whatever, there is often some like technological MacGuffin that everyone is like looking for, like, oh, we need the like the intercept machine, or we need the like the radio, whatever. And everyone's, you know, the Iranians are chasing around the Russians, and everyone's and oil money's involved, and et cetera, et cetera. That technology plays this important role in geopolitics. And so Stanford Technology Corp, the front organization, evolves out of a company run by this guy who's a sales agent for Hewlett Packard in Iran, out of Switzerland. And what you do if you're a sales agent for Hewlett Packard out of Iran, your job is to know who to bribe within the military so that they buy your like signals equipment, which you can, and your second job is to know how to evade export restrictions on those signals equipment so that you can, you know, send them out of the country as a scrap of tech parts and then reassemble them into a weapon on the other side that they can use for signals intercepts, for missile technologies, because missiles are chips. Radio intercepts are chips. You know, everything that they're using right now is coming out, the parts are coming out of Silicon Valley. Yeah. And so Palo Alto itself becomes like a center of world like spycraft. And there's all sorts of like crazy corporate and international espionage going on in Palo Alto. But the government uses this Stanford Technology Corp as the front for Iran-Contra. And one of the tools that they're actually using to run this scheme is the first laptop. And the first laptop was invented, you know, it's going to be bad because the company gets bought by Tandy, and so I can't remember what the original company's name was that does the first laptop. It's bad. I need to reread my own book. But it's this very expensive, you know, it's like if you watch a movie from the 80s, the super expensive laptop you open with like the orange, tiny little screen with the orange characters or whatever. And they were extremely expensive, and they were supposed to be for like, you know, senior executives, but basically no one found any particular use for it. Senior executives didn't use computers. Senior executives used tape recorders and then gave them to their secretaries. You know, into the 90s, still, you know, male professionals are still, that's their relationship to typewriters, whatever. They're like, we're not doing, I'm going to... voice assistants, right? The original voice assistant. They need computers, but who did love them was the NSA, and the National Security Council, and specifically Oliver North. And so he goes in, he grabs like a rack of these laptops that the government had upgraded with encryption chips, and he hands them out to the goons who are running this, you know, weapons dealing network scheme, on behalf of the federal government, if not with the fully informed knowledge of the federal government. Maybe you found a smoking gun, Malls, that shows who knows what where. I think we established that Reagan didn't really know what was going on because they insulated him, and it didn't really matter that if he knew what was going on, but that everyone else knew more or less what was going on.
Persico, who's Casey's biographer, has a really interesting talking about like psychoanalyzing your subject's theory about sort of why all this goes down the way it does. This whole story is really interesting to me because Bill Casey was very interested in technology. He was a super high tech, like he comes out of OSS in World War II and is like, we need to commercialize all this technology we've just developed in World War II. And that's sort of how he gets into venture. Is coming out of spycraft, out of the OSS, and is like, we have to file all these patents. We have to like start selling this technology. And that's where he sort of makes his next pile of money, is in doing what we would now call venture investment following World War II. And then of course he has his business publishing empire. And Persico's theory of Casey and Iran-Contra is that after OSS, after World War II, Casey just wants to get back into spycraft. He just wants to be a spy. He had the best time. He thought this was the best thing in the world. He really just wants to do this with his life. But he is a Catholic from like Brooklyn who did not go to Yale. Right. And he went to like night school for his law degree. And so he has all of this finance, and he's a financial lawyer. He's a tax lawyer. He's publishing on tax law and like estate planning. And so he's constantly getting pushed into these very high level financial appointee roles, which he doesn't want, but which he does a good job at anyway. This is the weirdest thing about him, is that he's like constantly doing the best job he can in his government position. So like in one case, he's in the SEC, he passes a set of rules. He like writes a set of rules for like secondary placement of privately placed securities. He's very proud of these rules. He gets out of the SEC, immediately starts working to change those rules because they affect him now badly as an investor. But at the time at the SEC, he was like, this is what the SEC needs, so this is what we're going to do. It's wild. And so Persico's theory is that at the end of this long thing, when he's finally like placed in the right position in the Reagan campaign, so he gets the CIA appointment, by the time he gets there, the Yaleys who are in the administration, they hate him. They think he's an interloper. They can't understand a goddamn word he says because he had a speech impediment his entire life. And the only person who could really understand him was his secretary, who he had the whole time. And so Bush pulls so much of the intelligence apparatus into the vice president's office. And they sort of leave Casey with this hollowed out entity where he doesn't have anything to do. Like they've stripped, like he just has no resources. He has no money. He has nothing. And so Persico's theory was that he sort of gins up Iran-Contra to do something that feels like spy work. And he's like, that's what he did. And I'm like, that is a wild theory, sir. And also kind of makes sense.
Well, and Martin Anderson says he has brain cancer. Is it Casey?
And he conveniently dies of brain cancer right before he's supposed to testify before Congress about it all.
So that's Martin Anderson's like, look, Casey had brain cancer and like no one else wanted to say no to his idea. Like no one felt like no one had a better idea. And so we went with like the brain cancer idea. And that was Iran-Contra.
This is a hilarious movie someone should make. I mean, the brain cancer part, obviously.
No, it does seem like a Coen Brothers kind of situation for sure.
Yeah. It's a very born after reading thing.
But it is like that. A lot of these guys were tech guys. Like Oliver North was very like tech guy as well. Martin Anderson was very tech guy.
Mm-hmm. Casey was very attached to the idea of high technology being the forefront of the new American imperialism. This was like a thing he talked about all the time, from when he was doing investment to when he was doing stuff for like the SEC and export import. And when he was in the CIA, he would constantly give speeches that positioned both technology and finance as these are the people who are the new front line. He actually has a whole speech that he gives at one point. It's actually a commencement address.
Pathetic, isn't it?
Yeah, it's wild. It's like, it's this commencement address that he gives where he's like, you guys, like, as you go into business, you will be the new front lines of the American, he doesn't say empire, but like the American project. Yeah. And then he gives a speech to a group of venture capitalists before he gets involved with the thing that I care about, where he literally calls them the they're the front lines. They are the scouts who go out and into enemy territory. And he says you could find something along the lines of like, you could find the treasure first, or you could get shot down first. Like, it's insane. Like, it's wild how attached he is to this collision of technology, finance, and militarism. That's like a huge part of how he thinks about things.
Well, and it's amazing the role that these laptops in particular play in terms of like enabling you to run a shadow government with 10 dudes scattered throughout strategic places in the world. That if you don't have those encrypted laptops, then you need a signals system, then you need the army. And then you've destroyed your own plausible deniability about the government.
Yeah.
And so it's the laptops as a like technological leap that allows these guys to sort of do their own thing with government resources and government power and, you know, pursue their agenda for America throughout the world. And it really is throughout the world, because like Iran-Contra is sort of a misnomer, right? Those are like two nodes in a network that also includes Afghanistan, that includes Angola, that includes like a bunch of other places that they're shifting money and weapons through. That includes Saudi Arabia, that includes Brunei, that includes, you know, the Medellin cartel, that includes Taiwan in particular. Like, you can get a better sense of these networks from, again, watching like random 80s like comedy thrillers where they're just like making up bad guys or whatever.
Who's the terrorist of the week?
Yeah, like because our understanding of it now is so blinkered just like by this name Iran-Contra, and it's like, we know like there's some drugs, there's some missiles, there were the Contras, three-way trade, it was wacky. And it's like, no, they were running a shadow government for the world with 10 laptops.
Yeah.
Like, that's the story, right? And that's the story of Silicon Valley, right? Not the Grateful Dead bulletin board, but the Iran-Contra net that was running a shadow government out of the... And so when we look at stuff now, when you look at Thiel and Anduril, you look at Ellison and Oracle, you look at some of these like creepy tech military, even like Schmidt at Google, right? And you look at their associations with the government and with the national security industry. It's got a long, proud history, right? And like Ellison, I don't know if you get into Ampex in the venture capital stuff, right? But like Ellison comes right out of Ampex, and Ampex is set up by spies at the beginning, right? Like, these are spies are there at the beginning of Silicon Valley. Setting Draper's a general, a lot of these people are associated with the OSS, with what becomes the CIA. Oracle is a CIA contractor from the beginning. The associations with the Office of Naval Research as a way to like get around democratic oversight of these inventions. It was like Vannevar Bush did not want the government to end up with the patents to the stuff that these universities figured out. And the way to avoid that was doing it through the military industrial complex. And so that's when we understand that, it's easier to understand the present of Silicon Valley. And now that they're going for prime military contracts, which is a change, it's an important change, and it's something that we should like know the history of. But it's not like, oh, Silicon Valley just heard about defense. Like, that's ridiculous. That's like, watch a movie in the 80s, like see who that they're talking about.
So there's two questions I want to try to get in before we wrap up in 10 minutes. The first one, the one I most want to get in, comes from Alice Fox, who just got her doctorate here at Virginia Tech yesterday. We're very proud of her. She's so great. And irony of irony, she's landed a gig at Stanford. She's interested in this topic. And so her question is, are there any opportunities to reconfigure? And this is, Malcolm, this is a question about how you're thinking about history here, is how I understand it. Are there any opportunities to reconfigure the vision of the future Silicon Valley has been, and continues pursuing to manifest? Or are we in a salt the earth and learn from our mistakes mode? So, I think this is like, what do you think about the future of Silicon Valley? What are your hopes and what are you thinking?
Well, I think that the salting of the earth was accomplished in the 20th century. Like that's what we need to undo. And I mean that like metaphorically, but also literally, like when they emptied the aquifers of the Bay Area, they started leaching in salt water from the bay. And so you have the environmental destruction of capitalist occupation of Alta California. I mean, obviously from the beginning, the gold mining period, but you know, in the 20th century to a huge degree, and you still have a huge number of Superfund sites and pollution in the area. And so I think we're sort of faced with the opposite situation where we've got people who are like, who have salted the earth, right? And salted the earth in terms of spoiling the environment, salted the earth in terms of like the housing situation, right? Like I've got people who have been fighting for just like low income senior housing in Palo Alto, like trying to like save some places where the people who made the good parts of Palo Alto good could possibly like live out their days in the city limits. And everyone's just like, fuck you, like get out of here. And like, so like, we've got a bad situation, right? We're in a moment of crisis. And so if we're going to learn from Stanford or from Palo Alto, I don't think it's going to come from the John Doerr Climate School of Stanford University presented by Exxon or whatever. Like, I don't think they're going to come up with the answers to the problems that they have created. So if that means salt the earth, then so be it, I guess.
We do have time for questions, so we'll keep an eye on that. And the other one, you know, we can go anywhere, but Malls and I were talking about earlier, is just like, you know, like since your book came out, I don't know when you finished, like, you know, writing and you were like wrapped it, but the bubble, you know, like a lot of air has come out of the bubble of the last decade. Like there's been a lot. So yeah, just how have you been thinking about that stuff in the context of this book you read? And, you know, if you were going to do like update it or whatever to imagine.
Well, I probably will for the paperback, I guess.
Yeah, why not?
So I'll probably do an intro where I talk about all the things that happened since, because it's a lot already. But it does make me glad that I didn't end the book on crypto or something, you know, because I think that's a real problem with Silicon Valley histories, is that they're very presentist.
Yeah, totally.
And like focused presentist. Like it's whatever the big thing in Silicon Valley is like that month when you're finishing your book.
Poorly for that reason, you know, it just looks so silly.
Yeah. Well, and they do. It means that it's got a like limited shelf life. And so I tried not to do that. I tried to focus on what struck me as were going to be the important things looking forward. And so I look at like nationalist tech. I look at like efforts to repress Chinese technology in the last chapter, like that for me looking forward, like that's what matters, right? Or like Anduril's like border technology, like that's going to be way more important to me, certainly than crypto, definitely than like AI, whatever. And so I'm trying to like give an analysis that allows me to pick out what in the present moment is actually going to be important 20 years down the line. And I think it's almost nothing that we talk about on a day-to-day basis.
I mean, this is what I take away from studying history and reading old newspapers.
Yeah, certainly.
Worried about all this shit that doesn't matter at all. You know what I mean? Like that's
and it's the same thing. That's what's so crazy is they don't even come up with new things to pay attention to that are wrong, right? It's just like still cybernetics. It's just cybernetics over and over again. It's like, what if the computer did all the work? And they like dream about it in different ways every couple of decades, I guess. But like,
I have a piece on ChatGPT coming out soon, and in a magazine. It's just like it's been so intense.
I just wish we could get a little like just extend the memory for just like this long. So it's like, all right, like who got the crypto stuff right? Like let's ask them what they think about the AI stuff. And if you got the crypto stuff wrong, or you got the metaverse stuff wrong, and if you were like really hyped about that like let's not ask you about this.
Guys still doing their shtick. Like they just did it 10 years ago or whatever with other AI. Moles, what are you thinking right now, man? What are you? Yeah, we got a couple minutes left.
I mean, literally what I'm thinking is I also have a piece that I have to put together on AI, and like I keep looking at it and then thinking like, look, when the discourse gets past the Chinese room, someone come get me.
Yeah,
then
right.
I will engage. But like it's stuck in this stuff that I remember from like the undergraduate class I took in the philosophy of AI. And I'm like, are we at being a bat yet? Are we at on being a bat? If we're not at
No.
on being a bat, then I don't care.
Well, and it's such an anti-intellectual culture and it's like strategically anti-intellectual. So that I love the like Sam Bankman-Fried, like don't read books because like books are lame, like books are slow. But it helps them sell stuff, right? Like if you know too much about what you're selling, it becomes, and like the history of it, it becomes harder to sell.
Yeah.
And so they like, if you want to be a AI influencer or whatever, then you have to forget about how you were a total fraud 2 weeks ago talking about crypto metaverse bullshit. And you have to be sort of like shameless and like goldfish memory about it. And like the industry needs that. And so like, no one knows what Sam Altman did. Like no one can give me his resume and say why he's like, why we should listen to what he's saying or trust what he's saying. It's like, and I can give his resume. Like I know what his history is. He like dropped out of Stanford and started Looped, which got crushed by Foursquare. And he failed up into Y Combinator, where he, succeeded by investing other people's money in Stripe, which again, still has not made any money. And that was the basis for him being, Wonder Boy to lead us into the like brand new era of AI and like artificial AI, artificial intelligence, ridiculous. Why don't they figure out some regular intelligence and then we can get to that.
I know. And this is why, I'm really looking forward to Mal's book because I think it's really important to bring together the story you've been telling, Malcolm, with like the history, like Fed policy, interest rates, and then the story Mal's is telling about the rise of venture capital, that you covered too. Well, this has been like as fun as I thought it would. I know we could go on for like 3 or 4 more
hours
without batting an eyelash, but this has been so great, guys. Thank you for doing it.
Thank you so much for hanging out with me.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. You can reach us with questions, comments, and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com or by following me on Twitter at STS_news or on YouTube at People's Things. Our podcast is distributed by the New Books Network, the leading platform for academic podcasts, so that you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Peoples and Things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. You can check out her work at julianacastro.co. Joe Ford is the producer for the podcast, and Mandy Lamb is the production assistant. This podcast and other Peoples and Things programming are produced in affiliation with Virginia Tech Publishing and supported by the Center for Humanities and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. For the entire Peoples and Things team, I am Lee Vinsel. And most importantly, I want to thank you for listening. Thanks.